Well, I'm forgetting things. I should start out with, anybody has anything that they want to offer, add, or subtract from last week's class? It may be important for you to participate this morning because obviously I'm on drugs. I think back in the 70s they say, I'm on drugs, man. I've got a t-shirt now that says, I lived through the 60s twice. Well, okay, with nothing, seeing nothing, I will try to read 11 through 17 of chapter 4. All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that for any man or woman who comes to the to the king, to the inner court, who is not summoned, he has but one law, that he be put to death. And this is Esther talking and reasoning with Mordecai because of the disastrous circumstance they find themselves in. Unless the king holds out to him the golden scepter so that he may live. And I have not been summoned to come to the king for these 30 days. And they related Esther's words to Mordecai. And Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not imagine that you in the king's palace can escape any more than all the Jews. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, and you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this. Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, go, assemble all the Jews who are found in Susa, and fast for me, and do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maidens also will fast in the same way, and thus I will go to the king, which is not according to the law. And if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went away and did just as Esther had commanded him. Not summoned for 30 days. He's not on his radar. Mordecai obviously reminds her she's not safe. But last week I gave you the preview, and I want somebody out there to tell me what I thought was the most important part of the whole book. This great statement of faith of Mordecai. Why did I suggest that was such a big deal? Jim? It's going to happen because it has to happen. Now, what's the rest of the story? Why does it have to happen? Deliverance for the Jews. What promise was made clear back in Genesis? Go ahead. Yeah. So if there's extermination at this point, there's not going to be David or the son of David to come and save us. So, I think that to me, that was the biggest thing that I learned in my preparation to try to teach this class, that's quite a statement of faith. If you blow it, Esther, here's your chance. But if you blow it, somebody else will provide deliverance. I mean, God will, obviously, through somebody. So that's, I believe, maybe the most significant thing I got out of it. Now, I mentioned God's providence. He reasons with her. You've been put in this current situation for this very purpose. Who knows, if the deliverance is going to occur at this time. And maybe it won't. And, of course, she bravely says, if I perish, I perish. And this particular situation, I think we've got to read this parallel to our Esther scenario right now. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in rage and anger, gave orders to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Then these men were brought before the king. Nebuchadnezzar responded and said to them, is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up? Now, if you are ready, at the moment you hear the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, and bagpipe, and all kinds of music to fall down and worship the image that I have made, very well. But if you do not worship, you will immediately be cast in the midst of the furnace of blazing fire. And what God is there who can deliver you out of my hands? We're going to see here in a minute, aren't we? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to give you an answer concerning this matter. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire. And here's the real parallel, I think. And he will deliver us out of your hand, O king, but even if he does not, basically, if I perish, I perish. Let it be known to you, O king, that we are not going to serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. I am ready for chapter 5 if you are. Anything up to this point. That back to last week. I believe we have time today. I must be doing a spectacular job. 5. We're going to read 1 through 4 first of all. And the situation is fasting has taken place, and here we go. Now it came about on the third day that Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace in front of the king's rooms. And the king was sitting on his royal throne in the throne room opposite the entrance to the palace. And it happened when the king saw Esther the queen standing in the court, she obtained favor in his sight. I know I say it 16 times, but providence of God. And the king extended to Esther the golden scepter, which was in his hand. So Esther came near and touched the top of the scepter. Then the king said to her, "What is troubling you, Queen Esther? And what is your request? Even to half of the kingdom it will be given to you." That sound familiar? See that again today, too. And Esther said, "If it please the king, may the king and Haman come this day to the banquet that I have prepared for him." Jews have done what they're supposed to do, fasting for 3 days. She's obtained favor, which is what we've been praying and fasting about. And then I'm going to show you this thing out of Mark. Pardon? Yeah. In Mark, I just, the parallel that I was suggesting in the scriptures, even up to half my kingdom, at a strategic day when Herod on his birthday gave a banquet for his lords and military commanders and the leading men of Galilee. Now that's even kind of a parallel. Remember the 187 days and military and then the common people? And when the daughter of Herodias herself came in and danced, she pleased Herod and the dinner guests, and the king said to the girl, "Ask me for whatever you want, and I will give it to you." And he swore to her, "Whatever you ask of me, I will give it to you, up to half my kingdom." I'm just suggesting that this is apparently something that drunken kings have to say. I'm pretty deep. Strategically, at this point, Esther didn't blurt out, okay? She waited. She sets the stage. There's going to be a second banquet. And when that occurs, she's going to be able to do what she's setting out to do. We're going to read 8 and 9 of chapter 5. "And if I found favor in the sight of the king, and if it please the king to grant my petition and do what I request, may the king and Haman come to the banquet which I shall prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king says." Then Haman went out that day, glad and pleased of heart. And when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, and that he did not stand up or tremble before him, homage again, Haman was filled with anger against Mordecai. So he leaves the banquet pleased, and pretty soon he's not. At home, his wife Zeresh and his friends advise him to kill his enemy. I didn't read that, but I think you're familiar with that. And that reminded me of Ahab and Naboth's vineyard, when he couldn't get what he wanted, he pouted. Jezebel solves that problem with murder in 1 Kings 21. All right, I'm pausing again before we go to chapter 6. Anybody want to add or subtract? Sometimes we might need to subtract. I'm going to share a secret with you. I am not the foremost authority in the book of Esther. It's possible that some of what I prepared may be less than perfect. Okay, chapter 6. You guys are kind, thank you. Chapter 6, we're going to see God's providence again. We're going to see ironic reversal again as I read verses 1 through 6. During that night, the king could not sleep, so he gave an order to bring the book of records, the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. And it was found written that Mordecai had reported concerning Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who were doorkeepers, that they sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And the king said, "What honor or dignity has been bestowed on Mordecai for this?" Then the king's servants who attended him said, "Nothing has been done for him." So the king said, "Who is in the court?" Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace in order to speak to the king about hanging Mordecai on the gallows, which he had prepared for him. And the king's servants said to him, "Behold, Haman is standing in the court." And the king said, "Let him come in." So Haman came in, and the king said to him, "What is to be done for the man whom the king desires to honor?" And Haman said to himself, "Whom would the king desire to honor more than me?" His timing couldn't have been worse. What a disaster for Haman. He does as ordered, and he returns home mourning, it says. And then we see Zeresh again, his wife, in verse 13. And Haman recounted to Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends everything that had happened to him. Then his wise men and Zeresh, his wife, said to him, "If Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish origin, you will not overcome him, but will surely fall before him." Again, not a perfect parallel, but this recalled to me Pilate's wife in Matthew 27. Remember, "I suffered greatly in a dream." Have nothing to do with this righteous man. So, there's a little bit of awareness of God's people. Can you bear with me reading all of chapter 7? That's 10 verses. Theron says he's a captive audience, so here we go. Now the king and Haman came to drink wine with Esther the queen. Again, drunken king. And the king said to Esther on the second day, also as they drank their wine at the banquet, "What is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Even to half of the kingdom, it shall be done." Then Queen Esther answered and said, "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be given me as my petition and my people as my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. Now, if we had only been," I love this part. This is diplomatic, boy. What a setting the stage. "Now, if we had only been sold as slaves, men and women, I would have remained silent, for the trouble would not have been commensurate with the annoyance to the king." That's strategic, isn't it? Then King Ahasuerus asked Queen Esther, "Who is he, and where is he who would presume to do this?" And Esther said, "A foe and an enemy is this wicked Haman." Then Haman became terrified before the king and the queen. And the king arose in his anger from drinking wine and went into the palace gardens, but Haman stayed to beg for his life from Queen Esther, for he saw that harm had been determined against him by the king. Now when the king returned from the palace garden into the place where they were drinking wine, Haman was fallen on the couch where Esther was. Then the king said, "Will he even assault the queen with me in the house?" As the word went out of the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs who was before the king, said, "Behold, indeed, the gallows standing at Haman's house, 50 cubits high, which Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke good on behalf of the king." And the king said, "Hang him on it." So they hanged Haman on the gallows, which he had prepared for Mordecai, and the king's anger subsided. For the benefit of those of you that weren't here last week, another one of the things that I had no idea about that I think is right based on Spain history, Persian history, is this hanging wasn't a noose and a rope. It was an impalement on a big long stick. Picture a telephone pole with a sharp point on it. So either way, I don't want to die, but I think I want to die less this way than the other way. All right. I'm ready for chapter 8 if you are. Yes, sir. Good point. I've seen Robin Hood, for instance, prince of thieves, and it took a while to construct the gallows there. Will? Yeah. Yeah. Torn from you, yeah. Yeah. Well, as a matter of fact, he's still going to lose stuff posthumously. So, yeah. Yep. All right. Anybody else? Thank you. Two good comments. See, I knew if somebody else talked, we'd be better off. All right. I'm ready for chapter 8, and we're going to read 1 through 8. On that day, King Ahasuerus gave the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews, we saw that earlier, to Queen Esther, and Mordecai came before the king, and Esther had disclosed what he was to her. And the king took off his signet ring. We're going to see that in Genesis in a few minutes, which he had taken away from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. Then Esther spoke again to the king, fell at his feet, wept, and implored him to avert the evil scheme of Haman the Agagite and his plot which he had devised against the Jews. And the king extended the golden scepter again to Esther. Remember, that coward Haman didn't come into the inner court. He was at the outer court when they made him. Anyway. So Esther rose. I think I got that right. Now, Esther rose and stood before the king. Then she said, if it please the king, and I have found favor before him, and the matter seems proper to the king, and I am pleasing in his sight, let it be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, which he wrote to destroy the Jews who are in all the king's provinces. For how can I endure to see the calamity which shall befall my people, and how can I endure to see the destruction of my kindred? So King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and to Mordecai the Jew, behold, I have given the house of Haman to Esther, and him they have hanged on the gallows, because he had stretched out his hands against the Jews. Now you write to the Jews as you see fit, in the king's name, and seal it with the king's signet ring. For a decree which is written in the name of the king and sealed with the king's signet ring may not be revoked. So you recall we had the previous extermination order, and that can't be repealed, but it can be overridden with a secondary law. I think we got to read verse 13 now. A copy of the edict to be issued as law in each and every province was published to all the peoples, so that the Jews should be ready for this day to avenge themselves on their enemy. And then finally, in verse 17 of this chapter, and in each and every province and in each and every city, wherever the king's commandment and his decree arrived, there was gladness and joy for the Jews, a feast and a holiday, and many among the peoples of the land became Jews, for the dread of the Jews had fallen on them. So again, an ironic reversal. Here we're supposed to be totally eliminated, and now instead, folks want to join us. So that's, I think, a pretty significant scenario in this book. I'll pause again at this point before we hit chapter 9. Lots of good stuff in here. All right, chapter 9. And please feel free to interrupt at any time if the Spirit stirs you, right? Chapter 9, I'm going to zip through about 5 verses here, hopefully not butcher it too badly. I'm going to start in verse 5. We're going to see the Jews kill their enemies. Thus the Jews struck all their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying, and they did what they pleased to those who hated them. In verse 10, if we look 6 through 10, we would see the names of the 10 sons of Haman enumerated. But I'm reading in verse 10, the 10 sons of Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Jews' enemy. They were all put to death. I mentioned a minute ago they weren't, when Will was talking, that the consequences weren't done yet. But they did not lay hands on the plunder. Now verse 18. But the Jews who were in Susa assembled on the 13th and 14th of the same month, and they rested on the 15th day and made it a day of feasting and rejoicing. So after 2 days of killing, there's a rest day. In verse 22, because on those days the Jews rid themselves of their enemies, and it was a month which was turned for them from sorrow into gladness, and from mourning into a holiday, that they should make them days of feasting and rejoicing, and sending portions of food to one another and gifts to the poor. The reversal is complete. Basically, it's Christmas. Sounds like it, right? Food, rejoicing, feasting, gifts. Then verse 28, so these days were to be remembered and celebrated throughout every generation, every family, every province, and every city. And these days of Purim were not to fail from among the Jews, or their memory fade from their descendants. Basically, never forget it. Pausing again for a second. And we're going to read one verse in chapter 10, and then we're going to see a 9-minute video, this Bible project. I'm going to challenge you with the idea of there's something in this video that was put together by mere men that is incorrect. So you'll be able to see if you can figure out what that is. I watched it 4 times and didn't see it, and my good wife saw it the first time. Apparently, I'm what the Spanish call an idiota. 10:3. For Mordecai the Jew was second only to King Ahasuerus, and great among the Jews, and in favor with the multitude of his kinsmen, one who sought the good of his people, and one who spoke for the welfare of his whole nation. And this is the parallel that I found in Genesis regarding our friend Joseph. Pharaoh said to Joseph, see, I have set you over all the land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh took off his signet ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand, and clothed him in garments of fine linen, and put the gold necklace around his neck. He had him ride in his second chariot, and they proclaimed before him, bow the knee. And he set him over all the land of Egypt. Moreover, Pharaoh said to Joseph, though I am Pharaoh, yet without your permission no one shall raise his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. Second only to Pharaoh. Last chance for comments before we watch a video. Will. day in, day out stuff. Yep, a lot of parallels. We spent more time studying other books, really, than we did Esther, I think. But hopefully that wasn't totally confusing. Okay, well, let's go ahead and do this thing. I think all I got to do is hit it. And, do I punch it again, Matthew? I suppose I do for it to start. Do I hit it, or do you make it work? Oh, okay. There we go.
Fact that God is never even mentioned, not once, which might strike you as kind of odd. I mean, isn't the Bible about God? But this is a brilliant technique by the author, who's anonymous, by the way. It's an invitation to read this story looking for God's activity, and there are signs of it everywhere. The story is full of very odd, quote, coincidences and ironic reversals, and it all forces you to see God's purpose at work, but behind the scenes. Let's just dive into the story. The book opens with the king of Persia throwing 2 elaborate banquet feasts that last a total of 187 days, and it's all for the grandiose purpose of displaying his greatness and splendor. On the last day of the banquet feast, he's really drunk, and he demands that his wife, Queen Vashti, appear at the party to show off her beauty. She refuses, and so in a drunken rage, the king deposes Vashti and makes the silly decree that all Persian men should now be the masters of their own homes. Then he holds a beauty pageant because he wants to find a new queen. This is like a really bad soap opera. But it's right here that we're introduced to Esther and Mordecai. Esther hides her Jewish identity and enters the beauty pageant and wins. And the king is so obsessed with Esther that he elevates her to become the new queen of Persia. Now, after this, and even more serendipitous, is the fact that Mordecai just happens to overhear 2 royal guards plotting to murder the king. And so he informs Esther, who in turn informs the king, and Mordecai gets credit for saving the king's life. Now, right here from the beginning, God's not mentioned anywhere, but this all seems providentially ordered. What is it that God's up to? You have to keep reading. We're next introduced to Haman, who's not actually a Persian. He's called an Agagite. He's a descendant of the ancient Canaanites. Remember 1 Samuel chapter 15. The king elevates Haman to the highest position in the kingdom, and he demands that everybody kneel before Haman. Well, when Mordecai sees Haman, he refuses to kneel, which of course fills Haman with rage. And when he finds out that Mordecai's Jewish, Haman successfully persuades the king to enact this crazy decree to destroy all of the Jewish people. And to decide the date of the Jews' annihilation, Haman rolls the dice. A die is called pur in Hebrew. Tuck that away for later. 11 months later, on the 13th of Adar, all the Jews will die. Haman and the king then have a drinking banquet to celebrate their really horrible decision. So the focus now turns to Mordecai and Esther, who are the only hope for the Jewish people. They make a plan that Esther's going to reveal her Jewish identity to the king and ask him to reverse the decree. But approaching the king without a royal request is, according to Persian law, an act worthy of death. So in a key statement, Mordecai, he's confident that even if Esther remains silent, that deliverance for the Jews will arrive from another place. And then Mordecai wonders aloud. He says, who knows? Maybe you've become queen for this very moment. Esther responds with bravery, and she purposes to go to the king with her amazing words, The book of Esther, it's one of the more exciting and curious books in the Bible. The story is set over 100 years after the Babylonian exile of the Israelites from their land. And while some Jews did return to Jerusalem, remember Ezra and Nehemiah, many did not. And so the book of Esther is about a Jewish community living in Susa, the capital city of the ancient Persian Empire. And the main characters in this story are two Jews, Mordecai and then his niece Esther. And then there's the king of Persia, who's something of a drunken pushover in this story. And then there's the Persian official Haman, the cunning villain. Now, this is a curious book in the Bible, mainly for the fact that God is never even mentioned, not once, which might strike you as kind of odd. I mean, isn't the Bible about God? But this is a brilliant technique by the author, who's anonymous, by the way. It's an invitation to read this story looking for God's activity, and there are signs of it everywhere. The story is full of very odd, quote, coincidences and ironic reversals, and it all forces you to see God's purpose at work, but behind the scenes. Let's just dive into the story. The book opens with the king of Persia throwing two elaborate banquet feasts that last a total of 187 days. And it's all for the grandiose purpose of displaying his greatness and splendor. On the last day of the banquet feast, he's really drunk, and he demands that his wife, Queen Vashti, appear at the party to show off her beauty. She refuses, and so in a drunken rage, the king deposes Vashti and makes the silly decree that all Persian men should now be the masters of their own homes. Then he holds a beauty pageant because he wants to find a new queen. This is like a really bad soap opera. But it's right here that we're introduced to Esther and Mordecai. Esther hides her Jewish identity and enters the beauty pageant and wins. And the king is so obsessed with Esther that he elevates her to become the new queen of Persia. Now, after this, and even more serendipitous, is the fact that Mordecai just happens to overhear two royal guards plotting to murder the king. And so he informs Esther, who in turn informs the king, and Mordecai gets credit for saving the king's life. Now, right here from the beginning, God's not mentioned anywhere, but this all seems providentially ordered. What is it that God's up to? You have to keep reading. We're next introduced to Haman, who's not actually a Persian. He's called an Agagite. He's a descendant of the ancient Canaanites. Remember 1 Samuel chapter 15. The king elevates Haman to the highest position in the kingdom, and he demands that everybody kneel before Haman. Well, when Mordecai sees Haman, he refuses to kneel, which of course fills Haman with rage. And when he finds out that Mordecai is Jewish, Haman successfully persuades the king to enact this crazy decree to destroy all of the Jewish people. And to decide the date of the Jews' annihilation, Haman rolls the dice. A die is called purs in Hebrew. Tuck that away for later. 11 months later, on the 13th of Adar, all the Jews will die. Haman and the king then have a drinking banquet to celebrate their really horrible decision. So the focus now turns to Mordecai and Esther, who are the only hope for the Jewish people. They make a plan that Esther's going to reveal her Jewish identity to the king and ask him to reverse the decree. But approaching the king without a royal request is, according to Persian law, an act worthy of death. So in a key statement, Mordecai, he's confident that even if Esther remains silent, that deliverance for the Jews will arrive from another place. And then Mordecai wonders aloud. He says, who knows? Maybe you've become queen for this very moment. Esther responds with bravery, and she purposes to go to the king with her amazing words, if I perish, I perish. Now, in what unfolds, we watch the ironic reversal of all of Haman's evil plans. So Esther hosts the king and Haman at a first banquet, and she says that she wants to make a special request of both of them at an exclusive banquet the following day. So Haman leaves the banquet totally drunk, and he sees Mordecai in the street. He fumes with anger, and he orders that a tall stake be built so that Mordecai can be impaled upon it in the morning. It seems like things can't get any worse for the Jews and for Mordecai, but all of a sudden, the story pivots. It just so happens that night, the king, he can't sleep, and he has the royal chronicles read to him for good bedtime reading, and he just happens to hear about how Mordecai had saved the king's life. He had totally forgotten. So in the morning, Haman enters letters to request Mordecai's execution, and the king in that moment orders Haman to honor Mordecai publicly for saving his life. So now Haman has to lead Mordecai around the city on a royal horse, telling everyone to praise him. Now this moment in the story, it's a pivot for the whole book. It begins Haman's downfall and Mordecai's rise to power. Watch how this works. The day after is Esther's second banquet. So the king and Haman arrive, and Esther informs the king that first of all she's Jewish, and second that Haman has enacted a decree to murder her and to murder Mordecai, who saved his life, and to murder all of the Jews. Now the king's had a lot to drink, so when he hears this news, he goes into yet one more drunken rage, and he orders that Haman be impaled on the very stake he made for Mordecai. It's ironic and a grisly way for Haman to go. Haman's execution, however, doesn't solve the problem of the decree to kill all of the Jews. So the focus now turns to Esther and Mordecai as they make a plan to reverse the decree. They discover that the king can't revoke a decree that he's already made. So instead, the king commissions Mordecai to issue a counter-decree. On the appointed day that all of the Jews were supposed to be killed, the 13th of Adar, now the Jews are ordered to defend themselves and to destroy any who plotted to kill them. Then Mordecai, Esther, and Jews everywhere hold banquets and feasts to celebrate this new decree, and Mordecai is elevated to a seat beside the king. Eventually, the decreed day comes, and the Jews triumph over their enemies. First, they destroy Haman's family, and then any other Persian officials who had joined in Haman's plot. And then on a second day, they get permission to destroy any who plotted against them throughout the entire kingdom. This results in joy and celebration as the Jews are rescued from annihilation. The story then tells about how Esther and Mordecai established by decree this annual 2-day feast of Purim to commemorate their deliverance from destruction. And the name of the feast comes from Haman's dice. Remember, Purim. The book concludes with a short epilogue as Mordecai is elevated to second in command in the kingdom, and we are told now with his royal greatness and splendor as the Jews thrive in exile. Now, step back. Notice how this whole story has been designed. The story was full of moments of ironic reversal, but we can now see the whole story is structured as an ironic reversal, right down to the details. So the king's splendor and feasts and decrees are mirrored by Mordecai's splendor and feasts and decrees at the end. Esther and Mordecai, they first saved the king, but now in the end they save all of the Jews. Then you have Haman's elevation and edicts and banquet that gets reversed by Mordecai's elevation and edict and banquet. And then at the center you have Esther and Mordecai's planning scenes, and then Esther's 2 banquets that act as a frame around the greatest moment of reversal in the whole story. Haman's humiliation and Mordecai's exaltation. Beautiful. Another fascinating feature of this book is the moral ambiguity of the characters. There's a lot of drinking and anger and sex and murder, of which Mordecai and Esther are a part. Not to mention their violation of many commands in the Torah, like marrying Gentiles or eating impure foods. And so the story's not putting Mordecai and Esther forward as moral examples, as if it endorses all of their behavior, but they are put forward as models of trust and hope when things get really bad. And so the book of Esther comes back to that question with which we begin, why God is not mentioned. The message of this book seems to be that when God seems absent, and his people are in exile, when they're unfaithful to the Torah, does this mean that God is done with Israel? Has God abandoned his promises? And the book of Esther